My ex-husband found out I inherited $55 million. He called. "I always loved you. Let's try again." I answered, "Of course, darling." He left his new wife and rushed over, but instead of me, my lawyer was waiting for him. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say, somewhere deep inside, long before you're willing to admit it. I used to think that was the kind of thing people said to make themselves sound wise in hindsight. Now I know it's true. I knew. I just didn't want to. My name is Claire Harmon. I was born in Savannah, Georgia, the only child of Edward and Ruth Harmon, people who built their money slowly, quietly, the way people of their generation did. My father ran a regional logistics company for 38 years. My mother kept the books. They lived in the same white house on Oleander Drive for 4 decades, drove sensible cars, took one vacation a year, and never once talked about money at the dinner table. I didn't grow up rich. I grew up comfortable, which is a different thing entirely. I met Derek Walsh when I was 26. He was tall, charming, the kind of man who fills a room without trying. Or so I believed. We married 2 years later in a ceremony my parents paid for, in the backyard of that same white house on Oleander Drive. I wore my grandmother's pearl earrings. My father cried. Derek gave a toast that made everyone laugh. It was a good day. For a long time, I held on to that day as evidence that something real had existed between us. It took me years to understand that a good day and a good man are not the same thing. For the first 5 years, life was what I would call ordinary, in the best sense of the word. We settled in Charlotte, North Carolina. I worked as a project manager for a mid-size construction firm. Derek was in sales, medical equipment, and he was genuinely good at it. We bought a house in a neighborhood with old oak trees and a proper front porch. We had 2 cats and a running argument about whether we needed a dog. We didn't have children. That was a wound we never quite found the language for, and eventually we stopped trying. The cracks appeared so gradually that I mistook them for the normal settling of a marriage. Derek started working late more often. He became distracted in that particular way, present in the room but absent in the conversation. His phone, which he used to leave on the kitchen counter without a second thought, was suddenly always in his pocket or face down on the nightstand. I noticed, but I told myself a story. I told myself he was stressed about a new sales territory. I told myself I was being paranoid. Was I paranoid, or was I simply afraid of what I already knew? The first real warning came from Janet Kohler, my neighbor 2 houses down, a retired school principal who saw everything on that street and said nothing until she felt she had to. She stopped me one Saturday morning while I was bringing in the mail. She looked uncomfortable in the way that people do when they're about to say something they rehearsed. She told me she'd seen Derek's car parked outside a condo building on Morrison Boulevard on 3 separate weekday afternoons. She told me the building's second-floor unit was registered to a woman named Amanda Sykes, who had recently started working in his company's Charlotte office. I thanked her. I went inside. I stood in my kitchen for a very long time. I didn't confront him that night, or the next. I watched instead. I noticed how he mentioned Amanda Sykes twice in casual conversation, both times slightly too casually. I noticed that he started going to the gym at hours that didn't align with any gym I'd ever known. I noticed that when his phone buzzed at dinner, his jaw tightened. By November of that year, I had enough. I hired a private investigator named Ray Stubbs, a quiet, methodical man who came recommended by a colleague. Ray gave me his report in a manila envelope 3 weeks later. I read it in my car in a parking garage on Tryon Street. I sat there for 45 minutes. Then I drove home and made dinner and said nothing. Derek asked for a divorce in January. He was gentle about it, which almost made it worse. He said we had grown apart. He said he still cared about me. He did not mention Amanda Sykes, and I did not force him to. We divided assets with minimal drama, sold the house, and went our separate ways. He moved into that condo on Morrison Boulevard. I moved into a smaller apartment near the University District and tried to remember who I was before I was Derek Walsh's wife. That was 4 years ago. Then, 8 months ago, my father died. And everything changed. My parents had been more careful than anyone knew. The logistics company had quietly become something substantial. Between the sale of the business, the property portfolio my father had built over decades, and the investments he'd managed with a financial advisor in Atlanta, the estate totaled $55 million. It came to me entirely. I was their only child. I did not announce this. I told only my attorney, Margaret Okonkwo, and my closest friend, Diana. I was careful. I knew what money did to people. I was not prepared, however, for how fast a secret like that travels. 3 weeks after the estate was settled, my phone rang. I saw Derek's name on the screen and felt the old, familiar weight of something I no longer owed anyone. I answered. "Claire," he said, and his voice had that particular warmth that I recognized immediately. Not real warmth, but performed warmth. The kind he used when he wanted something. "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. About us. I think I made the worst mistake of my life when I let you go. I still love you, Claire. I really do. Do you think we could try again?" I stood in my living room looking out at the city, and I felt something settle in my chest, cold and clear, like water finding its level. "Of course, darling," I said. "Come home." After I hung up, I sat down at my kitchen table and didn't move for a long time. The apartment was quiet. A car passed on the street below. Somewhere in the building, someone was running a dishwasher. Ordinary sounds. But inside me, something was turning over very slowly, like a wheel that had been dormant for years and was now beginning to move. What had he lost exactly by leaving me? That was the first question I asked myself, not to punish myself with it, but to look at it clearly, the way a doctor looks at a wound before deciding how to treat it. Derek had lost a stable, patient, reasonably forgiving wife. A woman who had worked full-time while he built his career. A woman who had handled the household finances, managed 2 refinances, and navigated the emotional wreckage of 2 failed IVF attempts largely on her own, while maintaining a professional life and keeping the social calendar running. He had lost all of that and traded it for Amanda Sykes and a condo on Morrison Boulevard, and he had done so without hesitation. And what had I lost? More than I had ever let myself fully count. I had lost the life I thought I was building. I had lost the version of the future I had quietly assembled in my mind over 14 years. The house with the bigger porch we talked about, the trip to Portugal we planned every winter and never took, the retirement that was going to happen somewhere warm. I had lost the companionship, the habit of another person, the small, unremarkable dailiness of sharing a life. I had lost time. That was the one I could never get back. Was I angry? Yes. But anger was not new to me. I had already processed rivers of anger in the years since the divorce, in therapy with Dr. Anita Reeves every Tuesday at noon, in long walks along the Greenway, in the very deliberate work of rebuilding myself into someone who did not need Derek Walsh's approval to feel like a complete person. What I felt now, sitting at that kitchen table, was something sharper and more specific than anger. It was clarity. He knew about the money. There was no other explanation for the timing. Derek Walsh had not suddenly rediscovered his love for me after 4 years of silence. He had done the math. Someone had told him. I didn't know who yet, but I intended to find out. And he had immediately begun calculating his odds. That was how his mind worked. I knew it better than he knew it himself. The fear came next, as it always does when clarity arrives. Not fear of Derek exactly, but fear of my own reaction. Fear that some part of me would want to believe him, that the part of me that had loved him for 14 years would surface and muddy the water. I had loved him. That was real. An unrequited love, or betrayed love, doesn't simply stop existing because it's been hurt. It goes underground. It waits. And I was afraid of it. I called Diana that night. Diana Park had been my closest friend for 11 years, a Korean-American attorney who specialized in family law and had the particular gift of being both brutally honest and deeply kind. She was the person I had called the night I first suspected Derek was cheating. She was the person who sat with me in the hospital parking lot after the second failed IVF cycle. She was the person who drove me to sign the divorce papers and then took me out for bourbon afterward and told me that this was not the end of anything except one chapter. I told her everything. The call. What I'd said. That he was coming. There was a pause on her end. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Clear," I said. "Unusually clear." "Then let's make sure you stay that way," she said. "Don't do anything without talking to Margaret first." Margaret Okonkwo was my estate attorney, a 62-year-old woman who had spent 3 decades in Charlotte's legal world and had the quiet, absolute authority of someone who had seen every variety of human greed and was no longer surprised by any of it. I called her the next morning. I drove to her office on South Tryon Street, sat across from her mahogany desk, and told her what had happened. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as measured calm. "So you told him to come," she said. "Yes." "Do you intend to take him back?" "No." "Then what do you intend?" I had thought about this through most of the previous night. I had lain in my bed in the dark and worked through it carefully, not with bitterness, but with the precise and focused thinking I applied to complex projects at work. By the time the sun came up over the Charlotte skyline, I had the outline of a plan. "I want him to come," I said. "I want him to commit fully to this, to leave Amanda, to make promises, to put himself in a position where everyone around him sees exactly what he's doing and why he's doing it. And then I want to be the one who decides what happens next. Not him. Me." Margaret looked at me for a long moment. "That's not revenge," she said carefully. "No," I agreed. "It's accountability." She nodded slowly. "We can work with that. But we need to be very careful. The moment he believes you're reconciling, he may start making legal arguments about the estate. Depending on how far this goes, he could attempt to reestablish community property claims, particularly if you allow any significant amount of time to pass under the appearance of a renewed relationship." "I know," I said. "That's why I need this to be short, precise, and documented." She picked up her pen. "Tell me exactly what you want." I told her. By the time I left Margaret's office that afternoon, the first real architecture of the plan was in place. Derek Walsh was going to come to Charlotte believing he was coming home to a woman with $55 million and a second chance. What he was going to find was something else entirely. The question was not whether I could do this. The question was whether I could do it without letting the old love pull me off course. I was about to find out. The first official step was the simplest and the most important: documentation. Margaret had been clear about this. Whatever was going to happen next had to be built on a foundation of recorded reality. No assumptions, no emotional testimony, facts, in writing, with dates and witnesses, arranged in a sequence that told a story no one could dispute. I had spent enough years managing complex construction projects to understand the principle. You do not improvise the load-bearing elements. I spent the first week in a state of disciplined calm that surprised even me. I kept going to work. I kept my Tuesday appointments with Dr. Reeves. I ate regular meals and slept reasonably well. I understood that the steadiness wasn't emotional distance. I still felt the full weight of what was happening. But I had made a decision, and the decision gave me a kind of structure that held. Derek and I exchanged several texts in those early days. He was in Atlanta. He'd been transferred there 2 years prior, which I had heard from mutual acquaintances, and was making arrangements to come to Charlotte. His messages were warm, almost tender, the kind of messages I might have wanted to receive from him years ago. Now I read them like documents. Each one told me exactly what I needed to know about his intentions, and none of it was love. I've been thinking about this for months, Claire. I know I hurt you. I want to make this right. Had he been thinking about it for months? Or had he been thinking about it for the 3 weeks since the estate settlement became a matter of public record in Chatham County? I knew the answer. I also knew that his sincerity, or lack of it, was not the point. The point was the pattern. Margaret engaged Ray Stubbs again. Ray, quiet, efficient, slightly rumpled in the way of someone who spent a lot of time in parked cars, began tracking the timeline of Derek's communications with mutual acquaintances. It didn't take long. Within 10 days, Ray delivered a preliminary report that confirmed what I had already suspected. A man named Garrett Holt, a former colleague of Derek's who had once attended our wedding and still lived in Charlotte, had heard about the estate from a cousin who worked at the firm of accountants that had handled my father's business. Garrett had called Derek. That call had lasted 42 minutes. 42 minutes. The length of time it took for a man who hadn't spoken to me in 4 years to decide he still loved me. I read that part of Ray's report sitting at my desk at work during my lunch break, and I felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but something between the two. The particular ache of confirmation. When you suspect something, and then you know it, the knowledge doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like losing the last version of the story where you might have been wrong. But here is what else Ray's report contained, and this was the thing that shifted everything. Derek had not left Amanda. He had told her he needed time to sort out some personal issues. He had not told her what those issues were. He was, as far as Ray could determine, maintaining both relationships simultaneously, texting me about second chances from the same phone he used to make dinner reservations for 2 on Friday nights in Atlanta. That was the point of no return for me. If there had been any lingering thread of doubt about what I was doing, any small, stubborn corner of me that wondered if his feelings might be partially genuine, Ray's report cut it cleanly. Derek Walsh was not a man in the grip of rediscovered love. He was a man running a strategy. I called Margaret from the parking garage below my office building, standing between 2 concrete pillars in the afternoon shade, and I told her what Ray had found. "He hasn't ended his relationship with Ms. Sykes?" Margaret confirmed. "No, he's told her he needs space, that's all. So he's keeping her available as a fallback position." "Yes." There was a brief silence. "Then we document it," she said. "Everything Ray has, the timeline of the Garrett Holt call, the pattern of Derek's communications with both you and Ms. Sykes, the chronological relationship to the estate settlement. We build the complete picture. And then you decide exactly how far you want to let him come before you close the door. I thought about this. I thought about how Derek had announced our divorce, gently, with that practiced warmth, in the living room of the house we'd bought together on a Tuesday night in January while snow fell outside the window. He'd given me no warning, no real process, no time to prepare. He had made his decision and then presented me with it as though I were a stakeholder being informed of a corporate restructuring. "Let him come all the way," I said. "I want him to make every commitment he's going to make. I want him to walk in the door." "Then we'll be ready," Margaret said, and I could hear in her voice something I had come to associate with her, a controlled, professional satisfaction that was probably as close to excitement as she allowed herself in business matters. Over the following 2 weeks, Derek finalized his plans. He told me he was putting his Atlanta apartment on the market. He told me he was requesting a transfer back to the Charlotte office. He told me he wanted to start over properly, take me to dinner, court me again, do it right this time. I responded warmly in carefully measured doses. I told him I was cautiously hopeful. I told him I needed to see the effort. He told me he understood. What I did not tell him was that during those 2 weeks, I had also done 3 other things. I had transferred all liquid assets into accounts held solely in my name under a structure Margaret had designed specifically to be airtight against any future community property claim. I had established a charitable foundation in my parents' names, making myself the executive director, which created a legitimate professional framework around the management of the estate. And I had written out, in my own handwriting, in a private journal Margaret had asked me to keep, a detailed record of every communication Derek and I exchanged. Date, time, content, and my own internal state at the time. He thought he was coming home. He was walking into the most precisely arranged afternoon of his life, and he didn't know it yet. Derek arrived in Charlotte on a Thursday afternoon in late April, driving a BMW he'd leased in Atlanta. Silver, newer than anything he'd owned during our marriage, the kind of car a man buys when he wants to signal that things are going well. I know this because Ray was watching the parking garage of the hotel where Derek had booked a suite, and he sent me a brief text. Subject arrived. 2:14 p.m. single occupant. Silver 5 Series. I was sitting in Margaret's conference room when the text came in. I set my phone face down on the table and focused on what Margaret was saying about the meeting she had scheduled at the hotel for 4 o'clock. We had designed it carefully. Derek had texted that morning asking when he could see me. I had replied, warmly, as always, that I had a work call that would run until 3:30, and that I'd arranged for someone from my office to drop some papers at his hotel before we met for dinner. That was the story. He expected paperwork, a courier, maybe a paralegal, something administrative, the kind of bureaucratic friction that wealthy people deal with and don't overthink. What was waiting for him instead was Margaret Okonkwo herself, with Ray Stubbs in the corridor and a folder containing 63 pages of documented evidence that his approach to our renewed relationship had been motivated not by love, but by a strategic response to the inheritance. I didn't go to the hotel. That was deliberate. I stayed in Margaret's office, in the armchair by the window that looked out over South Tryon Street, and I waited. The meeting lasted 47 minutes. Margaret called me at 5:15. Her voice was composed, but I had learned to hear the small textures in it by then. "He was not happy," she said. "Tell me." He had arrived at his suite expecting me. He had, Margaret said, clearly prepared himself, changed clothes, placed a flower arrangement on the suite's small table, opened a bottle of wine. When he opened the door and found Margaret, and not me, the confusion on his face was, in her words, immediate and total. She had introduced herself, handed him the folder, and asked if she could have 15 minutes of his time. He had let her in. To his credit, he hadn't slammed the door. He was, underneath everything else, a man who understood that creating a scene rarely helped. Margaret had walked him through the documentation in her precise, unhurried way. The timeline of the Garrett Holt call, Ray's records, the pattern of his simultaneous communications with me and Amanda Sykes, and a legal analysis of what he might have been hoping to accomplish. She had not accused him of anything. She had simply presented the facts and allowed them to speak. He had listened. He had asked several questions that she described as increasingly agitated. He had finally said that this was a misunderstanding, that his feelings for me were genuine, and that he resented being treated like a criminal for trying to reconnect with his ex-wife. Margaret had told him, calmly, that no one was calling him a criminal. She was simply making clear that Ms. Harmon was aware of the full context of his approach, and that Ms. Harmon would be in contact when and if she chose to be. He had asked to speak with me directly. Margaret had said that was Ms. Harmon's decision to make, not his. He had stood up, taken the folder, and said, "And this is the part I will not forget. You tell her she's making a mistake." There it was, the warmth, the tenderness, the performed love, all of it gone in 47 minutes, replaced by the thing underneath. Not sadness, not remorse, a threat, packaged as advice. I might have predicted this. I had, actually. Margaret and I had discussed the possibility that Derek, when confronted, might escalate rather than retreat. But hearing it confirmed still carried a weight. Within 24 hours, the escalation arrived in full. Derek had not come to Charlotte alone, as it turned out. His older brother, Kevin Walsh, lived in the Lake Norman area north of the city. Kevin was a contractor, a large, loud man who had always found me mildly amusing in the way that men like him find organized, detail-oriented women mildly amusing. Kevin called me the next morning at 8:15. He was not performing warmth. "Claire," he said, "what the hell is going on? Derek is devastated. You set him up. He drove all the way from Atlanta and you sent a lawyer to meet him. That's not right. That's cruel." "Good morning, Kevin," I said. "You think this is funny? He loves you. He made a mistake, okay? People make mistakes. You're going to throw away everything because of a lawyer sending him some papers?" "Kevin," I said, "I appreciate you calling, but this is a private matter between Derek and me, and I'm going to handle it through appropriate channels." Appropriate channels. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You know what, Claire? Derek told me about the inheritance, and I'm telling you right now, if you think you can pull some legal stunt and walk away from a man you were married to for 14 years without so much as a conversation, you're going to have a problem. Derek has rights. You were his wife." "I was his wife," I said, past tense, as of 4 years ago. "Have a good day, Kevin." I hung up. My hands were steady. That same afternoon, I received a text from an unknown number that I traced, through Ray, to Amanda Sykes. It read, "I know what you're doing, and it won't work. He chose me. He'll always choose me." I screenshotted it, forwarded it to Margaret and Ray, and filed it in the documentation folder under a new tab labeled Third-Party Contact. The antagonists, to borrow a word I had begun using in my own private thinking, had shown their hand. This was the nature of people who operate on strategic calculation. When the strategy is disrupted, they don't grieve. They threaten. Margaret advised me to cease all direct communication with Derek and his family and to route everything through her office. I agreed. The plan was holding. But the threats were real, and I was not naive enough to dismiss them as empty noise. What I needed, and what I gave myself deliberately and without apology, was 3 days. I drove to Asheville on a Friday morning. I checked into a small inn near the River Arts District. A quiet place with exposed beam ceilings and a garden that was just beginning to bloom in late April. I walked along the French Broad River. I ate at a farm-to-table restaurant where the lighting was warm and no one knew my name. I slept deeply. I called Diana on Sunday evening and told her everything that had happened, and she listened and then said, with the dry precision I had always loved about her, "He sent his brother. That's a new low even for Derek." I laughed. It was the first genuine laugh I had produced in 2 weeks. On Monday morning, I drove back to Charlotte, refreshed, clear-eyed, and ready for whatever came next. It took Derek 11 days to shift his strategy. I suppose I should have expected it. Pressure having failed. Kevin's phone call, the text from Amanda, the implicit threat that Derek had rights. He pivoted to something older and more practiced. He went back to the version of himself that had once made me fall in love with him. He went back to charm. It began with flowers, not delivered to my door. He was smart enough to know that would feel like pressure. But to my office, with a card that said only, "I'm not giving up." Dee, my assistant, a thoughtful young woman named Bria, brought them to my desk with a careful expression that told me she was waiting to take her cue from me. I thanked her, set the flowers on the windowsill, and went back to the site plan I had been reviewing. I did not look at the flowers again until 5 o'clock, when I threw them in the recycling bin on my way out. Then came the email. Longer this time, more personal. He wrote about specific memories, a camping trip we'd taken to the Blue Ridge when we were newly married, the night we stayed up until 4 in the morning during an ice storm because our pipes had frozen and we were convinced the whole house was going to flood, the way I used to make Sunday coffee strong enough to wake the neighbors. He was a good writer when he tried, and he was trying. The email was calibrated beautifully, nostalgic without being manipulative, warm without being inappropriate, specific enough to feel real. I read it twice. I felt the pull of it. I will not pretend otherwise. There is something in the human mind that responds to being known, to having a shared history evoked by someone who was present for it, and that response does not disappear just because you've been hurt. The pull was there. It lasted approximately 6 minutes. Then I forwarded the email to Margaret, added it to my documentation folder, and opened the project management software I used for work. What carried me through that moment, and I have thought about this many times since, was not bitterness. Bitterness would have been easier in some ways, but bitterness is a fire that consumes the person who holds it. What carried me through was memory of a specific kind. Not the camping trip he had described in the email, but the parking garage on Tryon Street 4 years ago, where I had sat for 45 minutes reading Ray's first report about Amanda Sykes. The way the concrete had smelled, the sound of a car somewhere below me, the squeal of tires on a smooth floor, the absolute stillness of reading something that ends a story you thought was still being written. That was the memory I used when I needed steadiness, not anger, accuracy. 3 days after the email, Derek called. I let it go to voicemail. His message was short and, I'll give him this, brave in its directness. "Claire, I know you're angry. I know I deserve that. I'm staying in Charlotte for a while, Kevin's place. I'm not running away from this. I want to look you in the eyes and talk. That's all I'm asking. Just a conversation." Kevin's place. He had moved himself into his brother's house on Lake Norman, 30 minutes from the city. He was embedding himself in proximity. That was not a love gesture. That was a tactical position. I listened to the voicemail 3 times. I noted the date and time in my journal. I did not call back. Margaret reported that Kevin Walsh's attorney, a man named Bryce Foley, whom Margaret knew slightly and described as aggressive and not particularly careful, had made an informal inquiry with her office about whether there was any basis for Derek to claim an interest in the estate assets given the renewed relationship. Margaret had been brief and definitive. The relationship had not been renewed. Miss Harmon had made no commitments of any kind, and any claim of that nature would be opposed vigorously. Foley had apparently backed off without pressing further, which Margaret interpreted as a signal that they were testing the terrain rather than committing to a strategy. They were watching, waiting to see if the charm offensive would open a crack. It was during this period that I found the social support that I had not realized I needed as urgently as I did. Dr. Reeves suggested it, actually. In a Tuesday session, she noted, carefully, professionally, that I was handling the logistics of the situation with considerable competence, but that I had not mentioned spending time with anyone other than Diana or Margaret in over a month. She asked whether I had been isolating. I thought about it honestly. "A little," I said. "It feels cleaner." "Cleaner isn't always better," she said. She was right, as she generally was. Diana organized a dinner the following Friday. She invited 4 women, all people I liked and trusted. Priya Menon, a fellow project manager I had known for 7 years. Carol Whitfield, a retired architect who was now on the board of the Art Center where I volunteered. Nina Castillo, a novelist who had briefly been my neighbor before moving across the city. And Sylvie Oduya, who was Margaret's administrative director and one of the few people who knew the full arc of what was happening from the professional side. We ate at an Italian place in the Noda neighborhood. Long table, too much wine, good bread. I told them everything, starting from Derek's phone call and moving through to the voicemail from Kevin's house. They listened with the focused attention of women who understand exactly what it costs to tell this kind of story. And when I finished, no one offered advice immediately. Priya reached over and touched the back of my hand. That was enough. What came after the silence was better than advice. Nina said, "What do you actually want the end of this to look like? Not the plan. What do you want?" And I sat with that for a moment, and then I said, "I want him to understand that I'm not the same person he left. And I want it to cost him something real." And Nina nodded and said, "Then make sure it does." Carol, who was 63 and had navigated a divorce from a prominent architect 20 years earlier and come out the other side with both her name and her dignity intact, said something I wrote down later that evening. "The best revenge isn't suffering, it's evidence." I carried that with me into the following week like a coin in my pocket. Derek was still there, embedded at Kevin's house on the lake, sending occasional messages that Margaret intercepted and documented. Amanda, I learned from Ray, had gone quiet. No more texts from unknown numbers. No social media activity directed my way. She was either waiting or she had begun to understand something about her own position in this arrangement. The plan was intact. The support was in place. The documentation was building. I was not alone. And whatever was coming next, I was ready for it. They came on a Saturday morning. I was in my apartment, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the project files I'd brought home the night before, when the intercom buzzed. I wasn't expecting anyone. Diana had a family thing. Margaret didn't work Saturdays except in emergencies. I pressed the intercom button. It's Kevin. A pause. And Derek. I stood very still for a moment. Then I pressed the button again and said, "Give me 5 minutes." I went to my bedroom, changed from my pajamas into slacks and a button-down shirt, came back, poured my coffee down the drain. I didn't want to offer them any. and walked to the front door with my phone already in my hand, recording. Recording was legal in North Carolina for a party to a conversation. Margaret had confirmed this. I had been carrying my phone set to record every potentially significant encounter for the past 3 weeks. I let them in. Derek looked tired. There were shadows under his eyes I hadn't seen in years, or maybe I simply hadn't been close enough to notice. He was wearing a jacket, which meant he had dressed with intention. Kevin was in his usual mode, big, occupying space, filling the room with a kind of aggressive physical presence that I think he confused with authority. "Claire," Derek said, "thank you for letting us come up." I did not say you're welcome. I said, "What can I do for you?" Kevin sat down on my sofa without being invited. I made a note of it, not outwardly but internally. A small, deliberate power move. Derek remained standing near the door, which I read, correctly as it turned out, as his attempt to appear less threatening than his brother. "We want to clear the air," Kevin said. "No lawyers, no investigators, no paperwork. Just a conversation between people who used to be family." "All right," I said. I remained standing. Derek spoke next, and to give him the full accounting he deserves here, he was good. He was very good. He said that he understood how it looked, the timing of the call after the inheritance, the involvement of his brother, the situation with Amanda. He said he could see how a reasonable person might interpret all of that as calculation, but he asked me, with that quality of directness he could manufacture so completely, to consider the alternative, that sometimes things that look calculated from the outside are actually two things colliding at the same moment, that he had been building toward calling me for months, and that the news about my father had given him the final push. It was a good speech. The word I keep coming back to is calibrated. Every sentence was calibrated. "I miss you," he said quietly. "I missed you the whole time. I missed the way you think. I missed what we were when we were good." He paused. "And I know I can't just say that and have you believe it, but I'm asking you to give me the chance to show it." I looked at him. I thought about Nina's question. What do you actually want? I thought about Carol's sentence. The best revenge isn't suffering, it's evidence. I thought about the parking garage on Tryon Street. "Derek," I said, "do you still have a relationship with Amanda Sykes?" A beat, very small, but I caught it. "That's over," he said. "Is it? Because as of 9 days ago, you were still making plans with her on weekends." The room changed. Kevin shifted his weight. Derek's expression underwent a very slight recalibration. Not guilt exactly, but the micro-adjustment of a person who has been caught off balance and is quickly finding the new footing. "Claire," Kevin said, his tone shifting now from reasonable to something with more pressure in it. "We didn't come here to get interrogated. We came here because this family has been through enough. And you holding money over Derek's head and hiding behind a lawyer isn't what I'd call—" "I'm not holding money over anyone's head, Kevin," I said. "The money is mine. It was left to me by my father, who spent his life building something for his family. Derek was not my family when my father died. The divorce was final 4 years ago. I think you know that." "What I know," Kevin said, standing up now, his voice getting louder in the way that men do when they can feel an argument slipping from them, "is that you were married to my brother for 14 years. 14 years. And now you've got $55 million, and suddenly you're too good for a conversation. Too good to even—" "Kevin." My voice was level. "I've had the conversation. I've had it through my attorney, who is a professional and who delivered the information clearly and without drama. What I will not do is have a different version of the conversation in my living room on a Saturday morning, without legal counsel, in a format designed to make me feel guilty enough to set aside my own judgment. Silence. That's what this is, I said, not harshly, just clearly. You came here to make me feel like I'm the one who's done something wrong. And I'm telling you, I know that's what's happening, and it isn't going to work. Derek took a breath. He looked for a moment like he was going to say something real, something off script. But Kevin cut in first. "You're going to regret this," Kevin said. He wasn't shouting anymore. Quieter was worse somehow. "Derek has options. You think your lawyer is so smart? We've got a lawyer, too. And there are things about this estate, about the way your father's business was structured, that you might not want looked at too closely." There it was, the threat they'd been saving, a vague implication that there was something vulnerably in my father's financial history, a bluff, almost certainly, but designed to plant doubt, to make me worry about what they might find or invent or publicize. I walked to the front door and opened it. "Thank you both for coming," I said. "Margaret's office will be the appropriate contact for anything further." Kevin stared at me for a long moment. Then he walked out. Derek paused at the door, and for a moment, one specific, human moment, his face showed something that wasn't calculation, something that looked like a man standing at the edge of a decision he'd already made and only now beginning to understand the cost of it. Then he walked out too. I closed the door. I locked it. I stood in my hallway with my back against the wall, and I will be honest, I was afraid. Not of Kevin, not of Bryce Foley and his vague legal threats, but of the complexity of it. The sustained effort of holding this course against people who were willing to be uglier than I was. There was a real physical sensation of pressure, like something pushing against my chest. I stood with it for about 30 seconds, and then slowly I felt it convert into something else. Not courage exactly. Something colder and more reliable. Determination. The kind that doesn't need inspiration to keep running. I picked up my phone, turned off the recording, and called Margaret. "They came in person," I said. "I have everything." The meeting was Margaret's idea, and when she proposed it, I understood immediately that it was right. "We could continue routing everything through correspondence," she said, "but I think you want this to be clear, not just legally, personally. You want him to understand face to face what has happened and why." "Yes," I said. "Then we call a meeting. Neutral location, both parties present with counsel. Everything on the table." The meeting was set for a Thursday at 10 in the morning at a conference suite on College Street. I spent the preceding week in suspended clarity. Not agitated, not excited, simply present. Diana came over the night before and we ate takeout and watched a movie we'd both seen before. She understood I didn't need to talk about it anymore. I just needed somewhere ordinary to be. On Thursday, I dressed the way I dressed for important client presentations. Dark blazer, good shoes, my grandmother's pearl earrings, the ones I'd worn at my wedding and not since, not for sentiment, for continuity. I arrived at 9:45. Margaret was already there, folders arranged, expression serene. Derek and Kevin arrived at 10:02 with Bryce Foley, younger than I'd expected, too well dressed, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who intimidates people regularly and hasn't recently encountered someone who isn't. Margaret laid out the documentation in her methodical way, not theatrical, not combative, but so thoroughly organized it created its own authority. The timeline of the Garrett Holt call, Ray's records of Derek's simultaneous communications with me and Amanda during the period he was professing renewed commitment, the The Saturday morning visit captured on audio recording, including Kevin's remark about my father's business structure, the text from Amanda's phone, the email, the voicemail, 63 pages of documented pattern. She did not characterize any of it. She simply presented it. Foley interrupted twice. Margaret dispatched both interruptions cleanly. Then Derek did what Foley had told him not to do. He spoke. "Claire, I know what this looks like. Yes, I heard about the estate, but that didn't create the feelings. It removed a hesitation. There's a difference." "Which hesitation?" I asked. He blinked. "What?" "You'd been with Amanda for 3 years. You had a life in Atlanta. What specifically hesitated?" He opened his mouth, closed it. "You left a 14-year marriage without hesitation," I continued, and my voice was genuinely calm. The calm of someone who has covered this ground privately so many times, the public version holds no surprises. You didn't call me for 4 years without hesitation, and then, within 3 weeks of a public estate settlement, the hesitation lifted. I'm curious about the mechanism. Kevin made a sound, not words, just frustration. Foley leaned toward Derek and said, not quietly enough, "Don't answer that." "I'm not punishing anyone," I said, looking at Kevin. "I'm simply not choosing to be chosen because I became valuable. That is not what I owe any of you." "You were married to him for 14 years, Kevin said. "Doesn't that mean anything?" "It did," I said, "and then he ended it. Both of those things can be true." Foley floated the legal thread about my father's business, now in professional language. Margaret responded without raising her voice. The estate was settled in full compliance with the court's process, reviewed by 2 independent attorneys, and any challenge would need to identify specific procedural irregularities, which Mr. Foley was welcome to pursue at his own expense and professional risk. Foley shuffled papers. He was on uncertain ground, and he knew it. Derek looked at me across the table like a man who had run a long distance towards something and arrived to find it wasn't there. "So that's it," he said. Not quite a question. "That's it," I confirmed. Kevin stood abruptly, chair scraping back. "This is vindictive. You've spent months building a case against a man who loved you." "Kevin," Foley said. But Kevin was already at the door. Derek stood more slowly, straightened his jacket, and looked at me one final time. Not love, and not quite regret. Something between them. The recognition of a man who finally understood what he had actually lost, which was not what he had thought it was. He nodded once. I nodded back. Then they left. I sat at the conference table for a while afterward. Outside the window, Charlotte was going about its Thursday morning. Trucks, coffee shops, the ordinary motion of a city indifferent to any particular person's reckoning. I thought I would feel more. I didn't. I felt clear. The week after College Street, Bryce Foley sent Margaret a 4-page letter outlining potential legal arguments. Margaret read it, highlighted 3 passages, wrote a 6-paragraph response, and sent it back within 48 hours. I never read the letter in full. There was no viable claim. Derek had been divorced from me for 4 years, had signed a thorough and final settlement agreement, and had no legal relationship to the inheritance under any theory North Carolina courts would entertain. 2 weeks later, Foley's office went quiet. Derek had stopped paying the retainer. The Atlanta apartment he'd supposedly listed before coming to Charlotte had never actually been on the market. He had been bluffing on every front. When none of it paid off, he folded quietly. Kevin stopped calling. Amanda had ended things with Derek during the Charlotte weeks. She had apparently understood before he did what kind of man she was dealing with. Margaret sent the final documentation in a bound folder with a handwritten note. This is now a historical document. I trust you'll never need to use it. I put it in the fireproof safe beside my passport and my parents' marriage certificate. 3 weeks after College Street, I sat with the foundation board for the first time. 7 people gathered to govern the Edward and Ruth Harmon Community Foundation. Afterward, a board member named Frederica James shook my hand and said, "Your father would have loved this room." I almost cried, but I felt him there. That was what I had truly won. Not just the money, not just its legal protection. I had won the ability to decide what the money was. My father hadn't spent 38 years of careful, quiet work so it could become a prize in someone else's game. I wrote Derek one final letter, personal, mailed to Atlanta. 3 paragraphs. No ill will. The estate protected against any future claim. And this, what you looked for when you called me, was not love. It was security. I spent 14 years looking for it in you. I found it elsewhere. I hope you do too. I walked it to the mailbox in the late afternoon sun, went upstairs, and made dinner. That was enough. More than enough. In every sense that mattered, the end. Charlotte in September is a specific kind of beautiful. The heat finally breaking, the sky going deeper blue. I was paying attention that September in a way I hadn't in years. I had moved into a 1940s bungalow in Dilworth with a wide front porch and a neglected garden waiting for someone to take it seriously. I spent August painting every room myself, not because I couldn't afford painters, but because I wanted to know each wall with my own hands. The foundation became the center of my professional life. 6 programs funded in our first quarter: literacy, workforce development, mental health support, neighborhood arts. I sat on the porch in the evenings with Howard, a dignified, stubborn beagle mix who regarded me with the blend of gratitude and skepticism that seemed appropriate given both our histories. The circle of friends thinned during the marriage was rebuilt, more honest and deliberate than before. And there was James, a structural engineer I'd known professionally for 2 years, met again at a farmer's market, and had dinner with. Then dinner again. Derek was passed over for the promotion he'd been angling for. Kevin's business ran into litigation. Amanda, I know almost nothing about, which is appropriate. What I know most clearly sitting on that porch with Howard at my feet is that none of what happened to them was ever the point. The point was this, just this.